Minnesota's governor says we could see a surge in ICE raids over the holidays.
At 4:20 a.m., while most American neighborhoods were silent and dark, federal tactical teams moved simultaneously across several states, breaking the calm without warning. Quiet apartments, garages, and small offices that looked ordinary hours earlier were forced open as armed units from ICE, the FBI, HSI, the DEA, and other federal task forces pulled Somali suspects from hiding. Fentanyl powder, fake pills, heroin, multiple firearms, and more than $600,000 in cash were seized in a single operation that stunned even veteran investigators. This was not a random arrest or a routine drug bust, but a direct strike against a criminal system that had survived for years by blending into everyday American life. Follow Military Power to understand what these early morning raids reveal about a hidden network, because this story is only beginning to surface. The first spark in this case did not come from a gunshot or a raid, but from a phone camera and a short video recorded by a college student in Minnesota. In the clip, the student spoke directly about immigration officers and warned that if ICE agents appeared in his area, violence would follow. The words were clear and personal, not abstract or symbolic, and they were delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the message would travel. This was not a speech about policy or an enforcement complaint. It sounded closer to a street warning, the kind often heard before gang clashes, where intent matters more than explanation. Within minutes, the video began spreading across social media platforms, moving faster than the student likely expected. Users reposted it, added commentary, and tagged federal agencies directly, turning a private upload into a public alarm. Some viewers treated it as entertainment, while others reacted with fear or anger. But the effect was the same. The threat became visible to people trained to notice danger patterns online. Once the clip reached that level of exposure, it stopped being a personal message and became a security concern. The distinction between political speech and a threat of violence is not determined by opinion, but by structure and direction. This video named a target, suggested future action, and implied readiness. For federal agencies, those elements matter more than motive. Immigration enforcement officers had already been facing growing hostility online, and the environment was tense. When a message crosses from expression into potential action, it enters a different category, one that demands response rather than debate. Federal officials moved quickly once the threat was identified, not due to public pressure, but because of the timing and context. Across the country, reports showed a sharp rise in threats aimed at ICE agents and their families. Online anger had already spilled into harassment and stalking in other cases. Against that background, ignoring a direct warning would have carried its own risk. The Minnesota Post fit a pattern that agencies had been tracking for months, and that pattern had already produced real-world consequences elsewhere. Identification became the next priority, and it happened quietly. ICE did not rely on rumors or screenshots to locate the individual behind the video. Digital forensics teams extracted metadata associated with the upload, reviewed account histories, and identified device signatures linked to the post. Deleted content did not slow the process because removal does not erase data trails. Login records, location signals, and behavioral patterns filled in gaps that the student may not have realized existed. This stage revealed a gap between how users perceive social media and how investigators comprehend it. To many people, online spaces feel temporary and chaotic, as if words vanish once removed. To federal analysts, platforms are structured records where time, place, and action leave marks. Even the act of deleting the video became part of the evidence, showing awareness after the fact rather than reducing impact. Once the source was confirmed, the case changed status. What began as monitoring turned into an active threat assessment. The focus shifted away from speech and toward capability. Agents evaluated whether the student had access to weapons, whether others were involved, and whether the message pointed to something larger. This process mirrors how gang-related warnings are handled, where violent language often signals preparation. Waiting for proof of action is not how prevention works. Interruption comes first. The upgrade carried legal and operational weight. The matter no longer belongs solely to campus administrators or local police. Federal agencies took the lead responsibility, treating the case as a serious security concern tied to officer safety. Information moved quickly between departments, not because drugs or weapons were involved at this stage, but because coordination reduces blind spots. When risk grows, isolation becomes a liability. Public reaction continued to escalate as the investigation advanced behind closed doors. Online arguments filled comment sections, with some users defending the student and others calling for arrest or deportation. These debates did not affect the process underway. Federal enforcement does not respond to trends or outrage. It responds to evidence and risk. As the online noise grew louder, the investigation remained disciplined. As the student attempted to step back from the original message, the system had already moved beyond personal intent. Apologies do not erase initial signals once they are classified as dangerous. Agencies measure threat by potential outcome, not emotional explanation. The original video had already triggered a sequence that could not be reversed by clarification alone. The purpose now was to ensure the threat stopped at words. This early phase revealed how quickly online behavior can lead to real-world consequences. It showed how digital warnings intersect with physical security concerns, especially in an era where enforcement work is already under strain. A single post had opened a door to a broader operation that would soon move beyond screens and into physical space. If you think social media is becoming a real-world trigger for violence and enforcement, share your thoughts in the comments. As attention shifted from identification to preparation, federal focus moved away from the online threat itself and toward the places where agents would soon appear in person, setting the stage for the next phase of the operation. Federal units entered the Minnesota campus at a pace that felt slow from the outside but heavy from within, as more than 30 agents from ICE, the DEA, and local police moved into position without making a sound or announcement. Unmarked vehicles rolled to controlled stops along the outer roads, while foot teams slipped through walkways and between buildings where students passed without looking twice. Radios stayed low and clipped, used only when needed, because silence itself was part of the control. The campus was awake and moving, yet the operation pressed forward as if time had thickened around it. Entry points were taken first, not with force but with presence. Officers placed themselves at doors, stairwells, and open corridors, standing just far enough apart to guide movement without drawing attention. Students were redirected with calm gestures, unaware that paths were being closed behind them. Parking structures were sealed quietly, and interior routes were monitored by agents who watched hands and faces rather than backpacks or banners. Controls spread across the campus like a net, tightening one thread at a time. Teams were divided according to plan, each unit responsible for a small zone that could be held without reinforcement. One group moved through student housing, where doors opened and closed in a steady rhythm. Another group covered an academic building, where lecture halls filled and emptied on schedule. A third held the outer edges, watching for sudden exits or changes in flow. No team moved quickly enough to draw notice, and no team paused long enough to raise questions. The first target appeared near a central walkway, walking with others toward class. Agents closed in from opposite angles, stepping between the individual and the surrounding crowd with practiced timing. Hands were guided away from pockets, wrists were controlled, and the body was turned sideways and moved laterally. There was no shouting and no visible struggle. Within seconds, the target was out of sight, escorted toward a secure area that blended into the background. Across the campus, similar movements unfolded almost simultaneously. Each contact followed the same pattern of approach, isolation, and removal. Agents relied on positioning rather than speed, using the crowd itself to mask their actions. Students continued forward, unaware that arrests were happening within arm's reach. Phones stayed down, conversations continued, and the operation advanced without interruption. Pressure grew with each detention, as the margin for error narrowed with increasing awareness. A sudden turn from a bystander or a raised voice could have drawn attention and shifted the mood. Agents adjusted spacing constantly, closing gaps before they opened. Every movement was deliberate because hesitation would have been louder than action. The environment demanded restraint as much as force, and restraint guided every step. As campus targets were secured, vehicles repositioned without delay. Teams exited the grounds in controlled sequences, moving toward nearby streets where the next phase was already unfolding. The transition was smooth, as if the operation had never been confined to the campus at all. Attention followed the network outward, away from lecture halls and toward residential blocks that sat just beyond the edge of student life. In the neighborhoods surrounding the university, the approach shifted, but the pressure remained. Cars slowed on quiet streets, headlights off, as agents approached buildings on foot. Entry points were checked, exits covered, and windows observed for movement. Each structure was treated as active regardless of its appearance. Doors were opened under controlled pressure, and occupants were guided into clear sight before questions were asked. Inside these spaces, movement was methodical. Rooms were cleared one by one, corners checked, and hands kept visible. Agents positioned themselves to control sightlines, preventing sudden movement from spreading tension. Individuals were separated and moved away from entry points, reducing the chance of flight or confrontation. The focus remained on containment rather than display. As locations were cleared, information flowed forward. Phones, documents, and personal devices were secured, and addresses were confirmed against active lists. Vehicles associated with each site were identified and held in place before they could be moved. The network revealed itself through proximity and repetition, not confession. Each address is connected to another, extending the reach of the operation block by block. Coordination between agencies intensified as the project's scope expanded. Local police managed perimeter control, while federal agents handled entry and identification. The DEA provided insight into movement routes and temporary gathering points, thereby shaping the order of operations in real time. Each unit worked within its lane, yet all moved in the same direction, closing space around the network. Tension stayed constant with every stop. Even when no resistance appeared, the possibility lingered. Officers maintained spacing and readiness, treating each encounter as potentially volatile. Sudden movements were met with immediate control, and silence was preserved whenever possible. Training emphasized calm dominance, and calm dominance shaped every interaction. By late morning, the network that had relied on the campus for cover was exposed across multiple locations. Temporary hideouts no longer blended into routine, and movement paths were cut off. The campus had served as a shield through density and familiarity, but that shield had collapsed under direct pressure. Enforcement followed the threat outward, ignoring boundaries that no longer mattered. Vehicles carrying detainees moved steadily away from the area, replaced by others, repositioning to hold ground. Agents consolidated positions, rechecking cleared sites, and confirming no gaps remained. Materials gathered on scene were logged quickly, ensuring continuity as teams rotated. The pace slowed slightly, but control never loosened. The operation left no room for retreat. Each movement had been observed, each path accounted for. The message was delivered through presence rather than words. What had been hidden was now contained, not by chance but by pressure applied step by step. As the final locations were secured and teams began to regroup, attention shifted away from movement and control toward what had been collected inside these sites, where the nature of the case was about to change again. The tone of the operation changed the moment agents began opening containers and storage spaces inside the locations that had just been secured. What had started as a controlled sweep focused on people now shifted toward objects, and the difference was immediate. Cabinets were unlocked, closets were opened, and hidden compartments were exposed with careful hands. Each discovery carried weight, not solely because of its numbers, but also because of its placement and readiness. The environment no longer felt administrative. It felt volatile. Firearms initially appeared not in display cases or locked safes, but in spaces designed for quick access. Pistols were found tucked beneath beds, behind loose wall panels, and inside backpacks placed near doors. Rifles were leaned upright inside closets, barrels angled toward exits, magazines already seated. None of these items was stored for long-term keeping. They were positioned for use. The presence of loaded weapons inside residential spaces shifted every assumption about the risk level faced by agents and civilians alike. Drugs followed, packaged and concealed with equal intent. Fentanyl powder was stored in sealed bags, some double-wrapped and hidden inside ordinary household containers. Fake pills were stacked in unmarked bottles, ready for distribution rather than storage. Heroin was pressed and portioned, indicating active movement rather than dormant stock. The proximity of narcotics to weapons removed any doubt about the nature of the operation. This was not passive presence, it was preparation. Other items filled out the picture. Cash was counted in tight bundles, some wrapped in rubber bands, others hidden inside drawers and furniture. Digital scales, packaging materials, and small tools were placed within reach, not stored away. Each object told the same story of readiness and control. These spaces were not just temporary shelters. They were working nodes within a network that assumed it would not be interrupted. As agents cataloged each find, spacing and posture changed. Weapons were cleared and secured immediately, with officers adjusting positions to maintain cover. Entry teams slowed their movement, scanning for additional threats that might not be immediately visible. The presence of firearms meant every remaining room carried an increased risk. What had been a matter of detention now required a posture closer to combat readiness. The danger extended beyond the agents themselves. These locations sat inside neighborhoods filled with families, students, and bystanders who were unaware of what was stored behind the thin walls. A single mistake could have turned a quiet street into a firefight. The reality of that risk reshaped the operation in real time. Control of space became as important as control of people, and every decision weighed potential collateral harm. This discovery forced a reclassification of the case. What had initially been framed around immigration enforcement now crossed into public safety. The presence of weapons and narcotics transformed the operation from a regulatory action into a threat containment effort. Agents adjusted their approach accordingly, increasing protective measures and preparing for scenarios that went beyond compliance. Communication shifted as well. Updates moved more quickly between teams, and coordination became tighter. Locations were revisited with fresh caution, and previously cleared spaces were rechecked. The operation could no longer assume that the absence of resistance meant the absence of danger. Every environment was treated as capable of escalation. As word of the seizures began to circulate internally, attention turned outward toward public perception and political response. The timing was critical. The operation was reaching its most visible phase just as allegations surfaced that threatened to reshape the narrative entirely. A claim emerged from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, stating that ICE agents had stopped and questioned her son during the height of the enforcement actions. According to her account, the encounter involved a request for identification and temporary detention. The allegation carried weight due to her position, and because it surfaced while the operation was still active. It introduced a political dimension that ran parallel to the enforcement effort. ICE responded publicly and directly, stating that there was no record of such an encounter. The agency reported that there was no documentation, no logs, and no internal reports matching the provided description. According to ICE, no stop or detention involving her son had taken place. The denial was categorical, leaving no room for compromise in the public statements issued. The contrast between the two positions was sharp. On one side stood a sitting member of Congress asserting personal impact. On the other hand, a federal agency relied on records and operational data. The disagreement unfolded at the peak of the operation, when attention was already focused on enforcement actions across the state. The timing ensured that the allegation would not remain isolated. Inside the operation, the claim did not alter movement or procedure. Agents continued cataloging weapons and securing evidence, following protocols shaped by the risks now confirmed to be present. The political dispute coexisted with the enforcement reality, but it did not alter it. Objects remained objects, and threats remained threats, regardless of external statements. Public debate intensified as the two narratives vied for attention. Supporters of the Congresswoman raised concerns about profiling and overreach. Supporters of the operation pointed to the weapons and narcotics recovered as justification. The divide reflected broader national tensions surrounding immigration enforcement, law enforcement authority, and accountability. Yet within secured rooms and controlled spaces, those debates had no influence. For the agents involved, the focus remained on safety and completion. Every weapon removed reduced potential harm. Securing every package of narcotics reduced distribution risk. The practical outcome mattered more than perception. The operation measured success in what was taken off the streets, not in how the story was framed. As the final inventories were completed, the scope of what had been uncovered became clear. Dozens of weapons and significant quantities of drugs had been positioned within reach of daily life. The network had not merely existed. It had armed itself and embedded its supply chain inside ordinary spaces. This phase marked a turning point. The case could no longer be discussed in narrow terms. The presence of weapons ensured continued attention from multiple agencies and justified the use of expanded tactics. The operation had crossed a line that could not be reversed. As the enforcement phase began transitioning toward legal and strategic review, the next stage would focus on how these findings shaped decisions at higher levels, where pressure, denial, and consequence would collide. The events that unfolded in Minnesota did not move randomly, but followed a clear path from an online threat to a coordinated federal response that expanded layer by layer. What began as a short video on social media quickly escalated into real-world danger, prompting authorities to treat digital signals as severe warnings rather than mere background noise. That shift set the foundation for everything that followed, linking online behavior directly to enforcement on the ground. Once that line was crossed, there was no pause or delay in the response. The process moved forward with intent and control. Multiple agencies aligned their efforts as the situation developed, bringing together immigration enforcement, narcotics investigators, and local police into a unified operational framework. Each phase built upon the last, starting with identification and progressing into coordinated action. The campus operation demonstrated precision and restraint, while the expansion into surrounding neighborhoods showed reach and persistence. Together, these steps revealed how modern enforcement adapts when threats spread across both digital and physical space. The results of the operation became visible through arrests and seizures that removed immediate danger from the community. Individuals connected to the network were taken into custody, cutting off key points of movement and communication. Weapons positioned for quick access were secured, and narcotics prepared for distribution were removed before they could reach the streets. These actions mattered not only because of their scale, but because of their timing. Risk was reduced before it could escalate further. Beyond the tangible results, the operation revealed how hidden networks thrive by blending into everyday life. Campus environments, residential buildings, and familiar streets had provided cover through routine and density. Once enforcement disrupted those patterns, the protection they offered collapsed. Movement became visible, connections surfaced, and silence no longer worked as a shield. What had remained unnoticed was forced into the open. Political debate emerged as the operation reached its most visible stage, drawing public attention and competing claims. Yet, This noise did not slow the work that was underway. Federal enforcement continued to follow procedure, guided by evidence and risk rather than argument. Records were checked, findings were logged, and coordination remained intact. The separation between public controversy and operational reality became clear as the process moved forward without interruption. What defines this case is not a single arrest or seizure, but the message carried by the response as a whole. Enforcement today does not wait for danger to announce itself loudly. It reacts when patterns suggest risk, even if those patterns first appear online. The ability to act early reflects an understanding that modern threats develop quietly before they explode. Prevention now depends on recognizing those early signs and responding before harm occurs. The operation in Minnesota also demonstrated that enforcement rarely concludes with a single phase. Networks adapt, shift, and attempt to regroup, requiring continued attention and pressure. Each arrest generates new leads, and each discovery raises further questions. The work continues beyond the moment of visibility, moving into follow-up and expansion rather than closure. This persistence is central to how authorities manage long-term risk. As agencies look ahead, the lessons from this case will likely shape future responses elsewhere. Similar online signals may now be viewed through a more urgent lens, and coordination across jurisdictions may become more common. The Minnesota operation serves as a reference point for how quickly enforcement can escalate when public safety is at stake. This is why the story does not end here. What has already taken place shows that once enforcement begins, it does not pause. To follow how these operations continue to develop and what they reveal about hidden networks across the country, subscribe to Military Power. And consider this as you do. Will actions like this remain isolated events, or are they the beginning of a broader and lasting phase of enforcement?